All right, let's open our Bibles tonight to Genesis chapter 30 as we want to get started and get going. We got communion together as well tonight. Genesis 30. We've mentioned to you a lot of times, I'm going to mention it a couple more just because some of these chapters, unless you're really willing to put yourself in the chapter and watch what is going on, you might miss the lessons altogether. But narrative, which is how the Old Testament history is written, it's also how the Gospels are written and the book of Acts, is really the best way to learn narrative is to put yourself in the story, right? Just look around. What does the Lord want you to learn? What is he telling you? You might read some of the narrative and go, well, what is he not telling me? And the answer is, I don't know why he's not telling you, but here's what he's telling you. And you can go by what God has given to you to learn. So we are joined tonight with Jacob from chapter 25 through 35. We have Jacob's story. And except for chapter 35 and maybe a little bit next week, Jacob is pretty much a rebel. It isn't really until 28 years down the road from where we are tonight that he's going to finally say, yes, Lord, you're the Lord. I'm going to let you be God in my life. But we have been with him for a little while, and he's still in the developing his testimony stage. I said to a pastor in Hawaii a couple of years ago, we were over there teaching a conference, I said, how's your son doing? He goes, oh, he's still working on his testimony, which I get, like he wasn't doing that great, but pray for him. So we've been with Jacob since he was born, although we've landed just a couple of times. He and his brother Esau were born back in chapter 25 to Rebekah and Isaac, their parents, after 20 years of praying to have children and finally being given these twins. Before they were born, though, the Lord clearly said, I'm going to give the right of the firstborn to the secondborn. It's going to be to Jacob, even though Esau would be born. And that's really all we know. There's very little written of the formative years of Jacob's life. The only thing we are told in chapter 25, verses 27 and 28, is that Esau was a skillful hunter. He was a kind of a man of the fields. And then you read, Jacob was a mild man, liked to be in the house, kind of a mama's boy. But that's really all that we know. By the time you get to the end of chapter 25, Esau comes in and he makes some of his red bean stew. Jacob is hungry, or Jacob, I should say, makes the red bean stew. Esau comes in hungry from the fields, and he said, can I have some of the food? And he goes, I'll sell it to you for your birthright. Now, this is something God had already intended to give to Jacob. Jacob really wasn't looking for the spiritual profit that would bring, or the responsibility. He just liked the fallout of the gain that would come his way. And so even at that age, he was really jonesing, if you will, just for gain, if you will. And he grew up in a very dysfunctional family. In fact, in chapter 27, we spent the whole week looking at all of the fallout that took place when Jacob was 77 years old. Can you imagine? As well as his brother. So we looked at Isaac. He was kind of the unspiritual father. He thought he was going to die. Thought he'd bless his son, even though God had said no. Blessed Jacob with the blessings of the firstborn. You know the story if you were with us during that time. God had a revealed will. Isaac sought to kind of circumvent it through kind of a secret little deal. Go make me some of your stew before I die. He wouldn't die, but he thought he was going. Meanwhile, Mom, this great family is listening in at the door. Here's Dad's plans. He says to Jacob, hey, your dad's going to bless your brother. We got to get in there before he does. And, I'll make the stew. You put on some goat hair and change your voice, and we'll put some of, your brother's clothes on you so you smell like he does. And we'll just fool him. Your dad's blind anyway. And Jacob, the unscrupulous brother, said, well, what if I get caught? I don't want anybody to think I'm dishonest. It's all kinds of dishonest. He just doesn't want to be found out, But he's into getting the blessing. And then there's Esau, who's really the example of an unsaved son, very interested in worldly gain. When he finds out he's been taken, he goes to marry a couple of very heathen women to kind of get even with his parents, if you will. Never really did come around. But the charade worked, or so we read. Dad couldn't distinguish the stews and the man in front of him. Esau comes back to find out the blessings already been doled out by his dad. Isaac finally realizes he's been duped, but he realizes that God was in charge no matter what, and he says, I'm going to leave it like that. I realize God is greater than I am, and even when I tried to do, I couldn't. Esau wasn't about to learn that lesson. He vows to kill his brother as soon as dad's dead and the grieving's over. Mom hears about it and says to her husband, can you send, my boy, the one I love so much, Jacob, away to my brother Laban's house, his uncle's house, back in the old country for safekeeping. But still it quiets down. Maybe he'll meet a wife there so he doesn't go the way of Esau. And dad signed on, and Jacob goes out the door. Mom would never see him again. It would be 20 plus years before his son, actually 28 years before it actually showed up back at the house. Isaac would still be alive, even though he thought he's dead already. Mom would not be. And then last week in chapter 28 and 29, at 77 years old, Jacob heads out the door in fear. He heads for Haran. It's 500 miles away. He stops for the first time miles from his home in a place that was then called Luz. He laid down on a rock. He was going to begin to grow in God's grace. And one of the things we told you when we started with Jacob is it's a bunch of chapters on the grace of God. A couple of great lessons in these chapters. Here's the first one. God's grace will keep even the worst of us. And second of all, no matter how dumb you are in trying to get God's will accomplished with all kinds of ungodly means, God will still get his way. He doesn't need your help, and you'll still be held responsible for your behavior. So you'll still get the fallout. God will still have his way. He does that in remarkable ways, but probably no place in the Bible over these many years of Jacob's life that you find that if you could work your way out of God's will, this guy would try so hard to do it, but he couldn't, because no matter what he did, God would still have his way. God would still direct his path. Well, needless to say, Jacob fell asleep. God gave him a dream. He saw a ladder reaching from heaven to the earth, angels going up and down. He woke and said, well, God's in this place. The Lord's here. Called the place Bethel. Surely God is here. And God made him a promise. First time we see the Lord speaking directly to Jacob, he promised him the provision of the land as he had made promises to Abraham. He promised him he would go with him, his presence would win, and he would protect him. I'll bring you back here as you've gone out. And Jacob responds with worship. He makes a little commemorative altar, if you will. He thanks the Lord for his promise. He begins to tithe, says to the Lord, I'll give you tenth of everything I have, long before the law was given by Moses. But his walk of grace had begun in measure. But like I said, it would take years, decades, before any appreciable changes were found in him. In chapter 29, he arrives at Laban's house. He discovers that his uncle is almost as bad as he is at hustling. He's going to be out hustling the hustler. He's deceitful, he's treacherous, he's trickery. He has two daughters, and Jacob meets Rachel on the way into town. She's beautiful, and he's immediately attracted to her. She has an older sister named Leah who is not so beautiful, at least not to Jacob. In fact, she had some twitchy eye problems. I don't know. That's what we read in the scriptures. So he asked for Rachel's hand after he'd been there a month, said, what do you want? I don't have any money, but I'll work for her, and get you a dowry. And he said, well, work 7 years. And he was thrilled with the prospect. And so this swindler who had stolen the birthright of the firstborn, even though God wanted him to have it, now finds himself in a pickle, because after 7 years, he goes into the marriage bedchamber at night, and in the morning he wakes up not to see beautiful Rachel, but her twitchy-eyed sister Leah. And he wasn't too thrilled about that, And so he went to Laban, and Laban said, well, that's the rules around here. Firstborns go first, and then those that are younger. If you'd like to have Rachel as a wife too, 7 more years of work, and it does seem they got married at the same time, but needless to say, he spends the next 14 years working for these 2 wives. And we talked a little bit, and we'll see it again tonight, that polygamy was never God's idea. It's a practice of the heathen. The Lord ordained marriage the way that you would know it to be, one man and one woman. And that's just God's desire and his direction. We ended last week in the verses 31 through verse 35, because as the favoritism was found in Jacob's home for so many years, you find it almost immediately in this home now, as Jacob has a wife that he doesn't care for much, seems to reject in many ways, and then a wife that he loves, but it's the wife that he cares for least that God sees her suffering and gives her the fertility to have children. And in very rapid succession, Leah has 4 sons. Now, it was one thing to have a daughter. A daughter, at least in the culture, would be, yeah, you have a daughter, everybody goes home. But if you have a son, there's a party because now you got to have a workforce, And so she not only delivered 4 children, she delivered 4 sons. And in every one of the sons, she saw an opportunity to maybe win the heart of her husband who preferred the other wife. So she called the first one Reuben, God sees my dilemma. She called the second one Simeon, God hears my cry. She called the third one Levi, which means to be joined together. Now my husband, maybe he'll move home and stay with me. And finally, she named the fourth one Praise, Judah. And it does seem like the other wife here in a little while, she, through this dilemma of competition and all, finally gets her eyes on the Lord and just says, maybe God will work this out, And it's a tough place to be because this is, these are God's descendants. This is his lineage, that he wants you to know. Well, tonight we're going to continue in chapter 30, just one chapter, the story of Jacob and Laban, of Rachel and Leah's 2 servant girls, maids, Bilhah and Zilpah. And we're going to see in clear pictures the continuing dysfunction that surrounds this family. And yet God will get his way. He'll get 12 children. He'll have a foundation for the tribes of Israel. But boy, we make it really hard on him. It's a good thing he's God and can pull it together. And we're going to cover 20 years tonight, 8 years next week. So this is 43 verses, 20 years. That's pretty quick. The competition over the love of one husband is found in this chapter. The superstition in seeking fertility through various, iconic means, the seeking of wealth through, the superstitions of the day, it's all here. And through it all, much like the incident of stealing the birthright, God will still move in the chapter and in our history them forward to where he wants them to be. He doesn't applaud these decisions. He doesn't reward them. He just watches over his people and accomplishes his will. Remember, he said to Jacob, I'll be with you and I'm not leaving and I'll get you back here. And he'll be faithful to do that. But Jacob certainly doesn't make it easy. And I think sometimes we're kind of in that same dilemma. We do everything to make sure that we're off on our own, and yet the Lord won't leave our side. He's not going to leave us or forsake us. And in all of this dysfunction, our mighty God functions to have his way. Doesn't justify the sin, doesn't applaud the wickedness, doesn't approve the deceit or the trickery, but it verifies that God will work, and who is able to hinder him? I think you can almost write over the top of this chapter, we have an overriding God. He's going to have his way no matter what we do to mess it up. I think these chapters, if nothing else in the Old Testament especially, tells us that God doesn't gloss over the sins of his people. When you get to the New Testament, you will read of Jacob, but none of this. Because in the New Testament, under the blood of the Lamb, the Hebrews 11 chapter only speaks of the accomplishments of faith, that which God remembers. He puts behind him the sins of man. He has paid the price for those failures, so they're not recorded, but they're certainly recorded for us here. And rest assured, through it all, God will get his way and hold us responsible. So tonight we were continuing with Jacob. He might have been a good con artist, but he's not a very good husband, not a very good father, and certainly a guy that needs a lot of God's grace. He's going to find it. But this isn't the best chapter to read, but we're going to read it anyway. Verse 1. We don't have time now. Okay, verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, like I said, the last 5 verses of the previous chapter, Leah had 4 sons in a row. Rachel envied her sister. She said to Jacob, you give me children or else I'm going to die. Sounds happy. And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And she said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of your womb? All of her life, I think Leah probably lived in the shadows of her younger and more beautiful sister. Here she was dominating the patriarchal portion of the house as she gave to Jacob 4 healthy boys in rapid succession. All she wants is for Jacob to love her. That's all she's looking for. Read back the last 5 verses of the previous chapter. I don't suspect that Rachel has ever come in second in terms of boys or dating or popularity. I'm sure that Leah was always kind of, in the background, if you will. And this is the same kind of favoritism Jacob and his brother Esau grew up in, and it continues. Look, everybody needs to be loved and wanted and appreciated. That old story about, the couple at counseling and the woman saying to the counselor, "He never tells me he loves me." He said, "I did too. And when? Well, when we got married, I told you I loved you." Not really enough. You never can tell your wife that I love. Enough. Kids are the same way, right? They just want your approval and acceptance. It was interesting. A couple of 10 years ago, we had a teacher here who brought in a bunch of, she said to her kids, I don't know if it was an experiment or she just wanted to know the kids better. She said, "I want you to write down on this letter a prayer that are important to you." And she brought back 6 out of her 35 kids had prayers that says, "I want my parents to love me." I thought, my goodness, how terrible is that? So Leah, I think, she put yourself next to her. She just longs for her husband to love her as a husband. Rachel, notice, she's just mad. For the first time in her life, she's playing second fiddle. And she says to Jacob, "You better jump in here and get me pregnant, or I'm going to die." To which Jacob responds, "Hey, I'm not in charge of bearing children. It must be God's upset with you. I seem to be fine. Have you met my other children?" Can you imagine? Her first move is to blame Jacob, who gets angry and blames her. Clearly, this is a problem between you and the Lord, Rachel. So Rachel, not quick to give up because she's never lost one of these battles, says in verse 3, "Well, here's my maid Bilhah. Why don't you go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." So here's the plot. And aren't you glad God's in charge at some point? A plot that technically would allow her to have a child by her maidservant. The term "a child on my knees" was a possessive law that followed even the days of Jacob. If you know anything about history, and I'm sure you do, 800 years or so prior to Moses coming upon the scene, there was a guy named Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a fellow who codified the laws, not for the children of Israel, because they didn't exist, but he codified laws that governed the Near East, from Persia down to the Caspian Sea, from the Euphrates all the way to the Mediterranean. He was kind of the lawgiver in the worldly kind of a sense. One of the codes of Hammurabi was that if a wife was infertile, but she had a maid who could bear children, she could legally ask this maid to bear children on her behalf. Common practice in the Bible. It was certainly a reflection of the cultures of that day. It was the standard kind of operating procedure. Everyone was doing it. You remember Abraham and Sarah followed that same principle. So Jacob, we can do that. Your grandpa Abraham did, and he got Ishmael. Let's go down that road. And she pushes just to do what? To catch up with her sister a little bit. It has nothing to do with the Lord or her love for her husband. It has everything to do with competition and who gets to be first. But it is, and I'll say it here, it's a classic case in the Bible of conforming your behavior to the character of the world around you, and eventually you absorb it and you become like the world around you rather than the Lord. You don't come out from them and be separate. In other words, you find yourself, well, everybody's doing. Well, yeah, but there's a standard, right? The Lord comes out and he says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transferred by the renewing of your mind so that you can prove what's good and acceptable. What's the perfect will of God? But so often the church finds itself living on the edges. Oh, the world's doing it. And so here we are doing it. One of the laws in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, the Lord said to the people through Moses, "You shall not follow a crowd to do evil." Don't join the crowd. Well, these are pretty good examples of joining the crowd. In fact, in Leviticus, in the law, the Lord says, make sure you keep my ordinances and don't commit yourself to these abominable practices of those that are being committed around you. So, unfortunately, these folks are kind of out of touch with the Lord still. They're not certainly walking with God. And from a competitive standpoint, I just want to have a kid so that you can't get the upper hand. She already had the love of her husband, but she didn't have children. Leah had children, but not the love of her husband. It is a huge mistake for her in this position to settle for something so low, to say, well, the whole world is doing it, and so we can do it too. Now, here's my lesson to you again. God superimposes his will on top of the will of the people. And so even though she may go this route, God will use all of these things to have his way. Would he have had his way anyway without it? Certainly. And we shouldn't forget that. But eventually there'll be 12 kids that will become, born to these 4 ladies who will become the 12 tribes of Israel. In any event, that's her solution. And so she gave, verse 4, Bilhah, her maid, as a wife to Jacob, who went in to lie with her. And Bilhah conceived, and she bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son. So she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister. Oh, yeah. And now I've prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So Jacob marries this servant girl. She begins to bear children, gives Jacob son number 5 named Dan. The word Dan means judge. Daniel means God is my judge. And Rachel names him believing God has vindicated her. See, God is still on my side and I'm about to win. But notice that the effort on Rachel's part is not driven by a love for the Lord or a love for her husband. It is all driven by a jealousy and an envy over her sister. Very dysfunctional family. It just doesn't, it's about as bad as it gets. Pleased with her success, Rachel promotes this yet again, and soon number 6 is born to Jacob. Naphtali means to wrestle. Rachel naming him, for she said, well, in the wrestling match with my sister, it's beginning to turn. It's 1-0 my favor now. Pathetic, right? Certainly pathetic. Well, Leah, of course, is watching all of this, and she's already had 4 children, but she still doesn't have her husband's love. So we read in verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and she made the same deal with Jacob to take her as his wife. And so Leah gave her maid Zilpah, and again Jacob bore a son. And so Leah named this boy a troop comes, and she called his name Gad. And her maid Zilpah bore Jacob another son, and Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will now call me blessed. And so she called his name Asher. So 2 can play at this game. So she sent Zilpah, who obviously is also able to bear children. And quickly, Jacob sees to have 2 more sons. One is named Gad. Gad means a troop, and I think Leah named him because now she's had 5 sons to her credit. I've got a basketball team. We'll call him a troop. And then Asher followed. Happy, for the Lord has made me happy again. Before my friend, I look like I'm the successful one. I now have brought 6 men into the world. Now, this is all very sad. It's very competitive. It's very much a rivalry. Leah, for the love of her husband, who afforded her but little love. Leah, because anything but first was not enough for her. She's a princess. That we go first. And so the motivations are awful. Add to that this cultural understanding, like I said, that not bearing children meant God didn't favor you, which was not biblically correct. Bearing them meant he must favor you, which wasn't really biblically correct either. And then having male children, oh man, you couldn't do any better than that. So, but again, I would just stress to you, God works despite the players. God will have your way in your life, even if your boss is against you, your situation isn't conducive to what you're looking for. God will have his way. I don't know how, I just know that he does. And you're only held accountable for your response. And learn from these chapters, this isn't a good way to participate with the Lord. It doesn't mean God is slowed down, but certainly his people are very fruitful at this time. Well, we finally get to verse 14, and we read this. Now Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found some mandrakes in the field. And he brought them into his mother, Leah. Remember, Reuben was her firstborn back in chapter 29. And Rachel said to Leah, "Could you give me some of your son's mandrakes?" And she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you've already taken away my husband? Now would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." And so when Jacob came in out of the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and says, "You must come in to me tonight, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And so he laid with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son, she personally. Reuben was Leah's oldest boy. If we do the math right, and all these kids are born fairly close together, he would have been 9 years old already from the last chapter, maybe a little older. He comes in from the wheat harvest with an arrangement of mandrakes, literally love apples, literally what the word means. I don't know if you know anything about mandrakes we were talking about tonight. They're poisonous. The leaves are poisonous, the root is, this will kill you. But there was some odd beliefs, superstitious, idolatry, living in a world like that, with a dad like that, that believed that, man, if you get the mandrakes, you'll be more fruitful. You'll be, it's an aphrodisiac. It'll change things in your sexual prowess. And so Leah, I think, sent her 9-year-old boy to go out and gather them, and then she was, I think, using them for herself. But in any event, she finally sold them to the other woman for the exchange of, "I'll hire my husband to come and spend the night with me." This is sad, right? I mean, the whole thing is just a sad thing. It does appear from this that Jacob might have stopped being intimate with his wife. Maybe her fertile time was over. So she now resorts to this perennial fruit, and in the hopes that somehow entice him, open her womb, and enable barren children to have children. There's no basis for that, mind you. This is superstition at its highest level. This is all that it is. There's no spiritual move here. It's just dysfunction. Rachel believes in it as much as Leah does. Leah even says to her, "What do you want? You have my husband, now you want to have my advantage?" And, they make a fair exchange, or so they think. That night, Leah was waiting for her husband to come home from work, tells him of the deal, and Jacob seems to go along without complaint. This guy is enjoying, I think, the tug from both women, I'm guessing. His ego, no doubt, inflated, but how sad for Leah. She desperately wants to be loved, but nothing could secure this love from her husband, at least not at this time. How sad for Rachel, who bargains with her, knowing everything like that, because she's got the upper hand. So Leah sleeps with her husband that night, hoping the old wives' tale about the mandrakes can get her another child. It's pretty sad when you see faith set aside and worldly methods to get what God wants embraced. And that's really what's happening here, right? They're leaning on the wise ways of the world, or the wisdom of the world, I should say, not upon the cry to the Lord. And much like Abraham and Sarah early on, when God doesn't give us what we ask, we do it ourselves, and then we give him credit. Well, the Lord must have, this is how he wanted it to be done. Sad. Verse 16 to me is very sad. "I have hired you with my mandrakes." When marriage is reduced to that. But because Moses wrote this, and we know that from the scriptures, I think Moses wants us to know that it was her prayer and not the mandrakes that God responded to. And so you read in verse 17 and in verse 18 that God listened to Leah. He didn't listen to the mandrakes. It wasn't moved by the superstition. Leah, at least at some point along the way, was asking the Lord for help. And here come this fifth son to Jacob, and they named him Ishkar. Ishkar means to pay, or to make wages. And she thought, well, God's paying me back for loaning Zilpah to the effort. It's just terrible theology and a poor understanding of the Lord. Verse 19, "Then Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son." She bore him 6 sons. "And Leah said, 'God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons.' And so she named him Zebulun, which means to dwell with. she believed that somehow the number 6, now she's given him a basketball team and one replacement apparently, plus the others from the other girl. This will bring him home. This is a sad picture of polygamy, dysfunction, competition. It just, put it in any culture that you want. This doesn't work for anyone. Verse 41, and afterwards she had a daughter, and no one seemed to be too excited. Her name was Dinah. Dinah means to judge, and Leah is now through bearing children. It was difficult to be a woman in these days. Like I said, they celebrated the birth of sons. They could have cared very little about the birth of daughters. So competition. Leah has 6 children born her. Rachel 0 as far as personal. Now, with the mandrake madness over, verse 22, God remembered Rachel, and notice God listened to her, opening her womb. I suspect that all of this is certainly, again, God's will of pushing forward these men and women to draw closer to him, having gone down all of these rabbit trails. But now the Lord hears her prayers. He remembers her needs. She conceives and bears a son, and she says, God has taken away my reproach, and so she named his son Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me yet another son. So God listens to her prayers. So here we have some indication of her seeking the Lord. Her barrenness is removed. She named the boy Joseph, which means he will add, or God will extend, because in faith she believed maybe God was the one that she needed to seek after. In chapter 35, so it'll be a little down the road, she will bear a final son, Jacob, her 12th son, his final son, Jacob's final son, Benjamin, which means the son of my right hand, and she will die. Rachel will in giving birth to this child near Bethlehem. We're going to spend a lot of time with Joseph. The last 12 chapters of this book are all about this one son and his ministry. So the birth of 11 sons, 1 daughter to 4 wives, 1 son yet on the way, as Jacob serves out his 14 years for Laban in working for these 2 ladies. They never resolved the conflicts. It seemed to go on year after year. We're going to find Rachel hiding, statues of the gods that she served as she heads out with Jacob away from trouble, away from her father and her family. Nothing has been resolved here, except everyone in their own right, Jacob as well, is starting to learn that, man, this is not a life you want to live. And understand, he's 97 years old now. 97. By the time we get to the end of the chapter, he's an old timer. He's got a ways to go, but still, some people learn slowly. He's one of them. One thing you never want to do is just, let conflict simmer, I don't think. You see a lot of parents, at least we do in counseling, where when divorce or when marriage troubles happen, the kids become the weapon. They get stuck in the middle, just kind of like these girls did here. Sometimes parents stay together for the kids, and the minute the kids move out, so do they. The best method is to get with the Lord and make it work, right? God has wisdom for you and your family. But God turns our attention from Jacob's home life, which we've gotten now over 14 years, to Jacob's work life, which really covers those 14 years plus the 6 that follow to get us to 20. Well, verse 25 says, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, I want you to send me away, that I can go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children from whom I have served you, and let me go, for you have known my service, which I have done for you. And Laban said, please stay. If I found favor in your sight, I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. And he said, if you'll just name your wage, I'll give it to you. Now Jacob had spent 14 years here. Got hustled, right? Was only going to stay 7. Wants to go home with his kids, has fulfilled his obligation, and yet to stifle his convictions, Laban needed only to offer him some more gain to get Jacob's eyes off of going home and back to where the Lord had told him he should go. an offer of a raise, and Jacob's interested because I think in Jacob's head, he went, I've been busting my behind for you for all these years. Maybe I can take advantage of this a little bit, Maybe I can work this to my favor. You need my help, then I'll stay and help, but it's going to cost you. For now, Jacob believes he could, I think, turn in some cash and some benefits and some dividends because God's still dealing with his son, and he needed to learn that God was the provider, but Jacob's a long way from learning that even after 14 years. Notice the word in verse 27, the word experience, because it is the Hebrew word for enchantments or divination, as though Laban, even though he used the term Yahweh for God, he was an idol worshiper. He could care less about Jacob's God, but he didn't want to rock the boat. And so in his idolatrous mind, if I'm getting a favor because you're hanging around, just hang around. I don't know how it works. I really don't care to know how it works. I don't want to know your God. But I feel it, the things are going my way. You've brought us a lot of good luck. You're a good luck charm. Please stay with us. This has nothing to do with faith. This is all about selfishness and personal gain. It's an eye-opener how often we read in the Bible of God's blessing upon others because of his people being in some place. It happens a lot. And you go, why would you even bless anybody? Jacob had been doing nothing but stupid. But God has a way of, we said this is all about grace, and boy, is it ever. We see it in, like I said, in more than one place. When Isaac went down with Abimelech to Gerar, it was the great blessing. When Joseph went with Potiphar into Egypt, there was that tremendous blessing. Abraham would be the blessing through whom all of the nations of the world could be blessed. So God does use his people to bless those around you. Well, Jacob, hearing this offer, I'll give you whatever you want, verse 29, said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little. It has increased a great amount. The Lord has blessed you because of my coming. Wow. And now when shall I also provide for my own? And so he said, well, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all of your flocks today, removing all of those who have speckled and spotted sheep, all the brown ones among the lambs, all the spotted and the speckled ones amongst the goats, and I'll take those for my payment. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come when the subject of my wages comes before you. Everyone that is not speckled or spotted among the goats, brown among the lambs, will be considered stolen if it's with me. And Laban said, oh, that it would be according to your word. Or translation, oh, I wish I could trust you. Right? So Jacob said, I'll give you the blue ribbon animals. I'll give you the show winners. I'll give you all of the beautiful ones that'll bring the greatest price. Meanwhile, I'll take the marred and the speckled for myself. That'll be my wages. I'll take all of the cast-offs and the spotted ones, right? The Lord said, without spot or blemish. I'll take all the ones you can't offer, if you will. They're not worth anything. Those will be my wages. And so when you come check, it'll be easy. The good-looking ones got to be yours. If they're enemy with me, then I'm a thief, and then you can deal with me according to that. And I think Laban, he already sensed there was something wrong. He's up to something. Because Laban is the kind of guys you'd shake hands with, and then you'd count your fingers, make sure you got them all back. He wasn't a very honest guy. The odds were low that Jacob would get many speckled, especially separated, and so Laban thought he had won again. Now, if you read lots of commentaries, you will read people say, well, Jacob obviously had become a great breeder, and for the next 6 years, he breeds these. He's got a way, and he's feeding them that. I'll tell you, to me and everywhere else in the Bible, this is another superstition. God was working, certainly. He was working to make Jacob wealthy enough to get him out of there. God had a plan. But this wasn't a result of breeding and being wise. This is, like the mandrakes. This was a stupid superstition that God would work around and work through. But needless to say, that was Jacob's deal. Help me to believe you. So verse 35, they agreed to this, and they removed that day the male goats that had speckles and spots, and the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and everyone that had some white in it, and with all the brown lambs, he gave them into the hands of his sons. And so 3 days journey, they put themselves apart, and Jacob began to feed the rest of Laban's flocks. And Jacob took some rods of green poplar from the almond and chestnut tree, peeled some white strips in them, exposed the white which was in the rods which had peeled. He set before the flocks in the gutters and the watering truck. Okay, Jacob, whatever. And when they drank, so the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth speckled and spotted and spotted and speckled and streaked, if you will. And Jacob separated those lambs and made the flocks face towards the streaked and all the brown of the flocks of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flocks. And it came to pass, whenever the strongest livestock conceived, Jacob placed those rods before their eyes in the gutters of the livestock, so that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he didn't put them in, as the feebler were Laban's and the strongest were Jacob. And the man being himself extremely prosperous, and had large flocks, male and female, servants, camels, donkeys. Oh, this guy's a hustler. Whatever the cause, and whichever way you read into these things, Laban's sons were not happy. And over 6 years, they watched their inheritance switch sides. And Jacob got wealthier, and they became poor. In fact, the very first verse of the next chapter said, when Jacob heard the words of Laban's son saying, Jacob has taken away all that our fathers, and from, and what was ours fathers, he has acquired all of his wealth. And Jacob, seeing the face of Laban, realized it was probably time to leave. God's way of moving Jacob along. So God was going to use this to move Jacob home. That's where he wanted to be. That's where he should have been. He didn't belong here. Jacob would later acknowledge, looking back, that the hand of God had done this work, and even 8 years from now, when he finally does get home, he will be able to say and look back, God took me through this to get me where I needed to be. For Laban the hustler, it was almost more than he could take. You will find in the next chapter, as Jacob has to leave, Jacob leaves under cover of darkness. He tries to get a head start because they're already 3 days apart. There is a confrontation between Laban and Jacob. There is then a confrontation between Jacob and his brother Esau, who 20 years earlier had said, as soon as Dad dies, I'm going to kill you. And Jacob finally comes to a place in his life where he has to consider that it's more than just giving God lip service. I got to give the Lord my life. Now, trust me, when Jacob gets out from under the pressure, when Laban's family doesn't kill him, when his brother lets him go, Jacob goes right back to old Jacob. And though, like, God, if you'll see me through this, I'll change my life. And then you do, and I go, yeah, maybe I won't. It's kind of Jacob for the next 8 years. The lesson here is, though God's persistent work in our lives, it will bring about his will, but the function of God in the dysfunction of man and his sin is to bring you closer to him. And that's something that we would certainly not want to miss out on. And I would say to you, even next week you don't want to miss, I love next week, but Jacob, when he meets with his brother Esau in chapter 33, he lies to him. He says, I'll meet with you. I'm going to see you. We're going to be fine. High five. Love you, bro. After he'd sent him like $1 million worth of stuff to try to calm him down, he then heads in another direction. And he stops well short of where he's supposed to be and spends the next 8 years in front of a pagan city where, if you've read chapter 34, a horrible incident takes place with one of his daughters, but he put his family in this condition. So it isn't until chapter 35 that Jacob goes, all right, I give up. Lord, I give up. And Lord goes, hello, Israel, welcome home. Now you are being governed by God. So you can go through your whole life, and the Lord loves you and knows you and wants to do a work in you, and he'll get his will done in your life. But it isn't until you surrender to him that you benefit from that relationship. God will still have his way. I know that you think sometimes you're in charge. You're not. You're on that string, and he'll do whatever he wants with you. That's the Lord. That's good. But at the same time, he would rather that you walk in faith and submit yourself. He'll get his will done, but you'll be on the same page with him. And then you can be, and find the best of life rather than all of this misery that self and sin and willingness to let God be God can bring into your life. You won't mess up God's plans. Sure, mess up your own, though. So we'll pick up with this next week, and things will get better. Just hang with us to chapter 35. If you're quitting on Wednesday nights, don't do it till after chapter 35, okay? We don't want to lose you until the whole story is told. Father, how we love you tonight and are so thankful as we just bear through these very revealing and very stark and very blatant kind of insights into the life of one of the patriarchs and the dysfunction that came from the life of his father Abraham, the terrible kind of partisanship that went on in Isaac's home, and now for the last 14 years what we read here, the suffering and the sadness that marrying over and over again, the favoritism, the competition, the rivalry, none of it having to do with you, will bring. And yet, Lord, we see your hand and your hand upon the situation, upon the hearts. You have tremendous grace for Jacob and for his family. You have great plans for our lives. You are ever patient. But Lord, help us to see that though your will gets done, what you would really want from us is that we would be able to participate in your will and find the joy of just following and walking with you. And so my prayer for us tonight, Lord, is that we would be willing to just let you be God, not to manipulate or hustle or try to live by by our instincts or our wit or rely upon those things, but we would rely upon you to even to build the church, to save the lost, to bless your people, that you would do that work and that we wouldn't get in the way, but we would get with you. Lord, I just remember Pastor Chuck saying to us, your job is to find out where God is going and walk with him. Help us to know where you're going and walk with you. And I would say that to you tonight. You can mess it up, or you can stand tall in the things of God and find his best. It's up to you. God will be gracious. God is very fair. God's ways won't be there won't be uprooted. He'll have his way. But you can come along suffering all along the way, or you can just come along and rejoicing in his ways. Tonight we're going to have communion together. We're going to just, again, look to the Lord who gave us life to begin with, the hope that we have. Some of the servants from our children and nursery ministries are going to come to serve you. Pray for these ladies. They serve where few people see them, especially if you don't have little children over there in the Sunday school. But they serve faithfully, and they're the reason I think your kids come home with Bible verses and know what God is doing in their hearts. So let's worship together and hang on to the bread and cup till everyone's served, and we'll have communion together.